4 to 7,000 soldiers, 100,000 Persians backed by side chariots, war elephants, and the entire treasury of the richest empire on earth. Open plains chosen specifically to eliminate any advantage terrain might offer. Every military mind in the ancient world knew how this would end. The Macedonian upstart crushed beneath the weight of Persian numbers. It didn't. This wasn't just another battle in Alexander's Eastern campaign. This was a moment that would decide whether one young king's impossible dream would die in the dust of Mesopotamia, or whether an empire that had ruled from Egypt to India for 2 centuries would shatter in a single afternoon. What happened on October 1st, 331 BC, involved cavalry that became a smokescreen, dust clouds that turned into deception, and one perfectly timed wedge that transformed visibility itself into a weapon. The answer wasn't strength. It was making an entire army disappear in broad daylight. To understand how a flat, featureless plain became the grave of Persian power, you have to picture the world in the autumn of 331 BC. For 3 years, Alexander had been pushing east, carving through Persian territories like a blade through silk. Victories at Granicus and Issus had announced his arrival. The siege of Tyre had proven his patience. The conquest of Egypt had given him legitimacy. But Darius III, King of Kings, ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, still commanded resources that made Macedonia look like a border province. He had retreated from previous encounters, regrouped, and now stood ready with an army larger than anything Alexander had faced. This time, there would be no narrow passes to neutralize numbers, no rivers to anchor flanks, no hills to break cavalry charges. Darius had chosen his ground carefully, the plains near Gaugamela, flattened and cleared of obstacles, a killing field designed for the Persian way of war. Chariots needed space to build speed. The cavalry needed room to envelop. And the King of Kings needed his enemy to have nowhere to hide. Alexander marched toward it anyway. The stakes reached far beyond 2 kings settling a dispute. Behind the Macedonian line stretched a supply chain that crossed 2 continents, connecting soldiers to homes they hadn't seen in years. Ahead lay the heartland of Persian power, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, cities whose treasuries could fund decades of campaigning or leave Alexander's army penniless and stranded if the gamble failed. This was far more than a military confrontation. This was the moment when the old world order, Persian dominance that had shaped politics, trade, and culture for generations, would either reassert itself through overwhelming force or fracture beyond repair. For Darius, defeat meant losing more than a battle. It meant watching an empire built by Cyrus the Great collapse under the weight of a Macedonian nobody half his age. For Alexander, failure meant his entire expedition ending in the dust, his name becoming a cautionary tale about ambition exceeding grasp. The soldiers on both sides understood. Whoever left this field broken would never recover. By the time Alexander scouts first glimpse of Persian camp, the scale of what awaited became impossible to ignore. The encampment stretched across the horizon like a city that had appeared overnight. Tents by the thousands, standard from provinces whose names the Macedonians could barely pronounce. The cavalry alone, Bactrians, Scythians, Armenians, Sogdians, represented more mounted warriors than most kingdoms could field as entire armies. Darius had positioned his side chariots in the center, wheels fitted with blades designed to shred infantry formations into chaos. Behind them, Persian immortals stood in ranks so deep they seemed endless. The wings spread wide, packed with cavalrymen to wrap around any force foolish enough to meet them head-on. From Alexander's position, watching the Persian preparations, the mathematics felt crushing. Every tactical calculation suggested the same conclusion. Fight here, in the open, against numbers this overwhelming, and the phalanx would be surrounded, isolated, destroyed piece by piece. Against this, Alexander commanded a force that had marched thousands of miles and fought dozens of engagements without breaking. His phalanx, Macedonian infantry armed with sarissas, pikes so long they created a forest of iron points, formed the spine of everything he did. But they numbered only in the thousands, not tens of thousands. His companion cavalry, elite horsemen who had followed him from the Balkans to Mesopotamia, were perhaps the finest mounted warriors in the world. But they were outnumbered 5 to 1 by Persian horsemen bred for this exact terrain. Alexander had some advantages: discipline that came from years fighting together, commanders who understood his mind without needing lengthy orders, and a flexibility in tactics that allowed rapid adjustments mid-battle. But standing on the plain near Gaugamela, Watching the Persian army spread across the land like a flood, those advantages felt abstract against the concrete reality of being outnumbered 2-1. The Macedonians made camp within sight of the enemy. No one slept well that night. The fires across the valley seemed to multiply in the darkness, each one representing soldiers who would try to kill them when morning came. Dawn arrived cold and clear, the kind of visibility that should have made deception impossible. Darius positioned his forces exactly as planned. Chariots forward, infantry center, cavalry wings extending so far they could envelop anything in front of them. The ground had been leveled and smooth for days, removing rocks and obstacles that might hinder the chariots' charge. Everything favored Persian strengths: space, numbers, momentum. Alexander formed his army in oblique order, refusing his left flank while strengthening his right. It was a formation designed to concentrate force at a single point rather than matching the enemy across the entire line. To the Persians watching from across the plain, it must have looked like desperation, trying to punch through before being surrounded. They weren't entirely wrong. What they couldn't see was a calculation behind it, the understanding that this battle wouldn't be won by matching strength against strength. It would be won by creating confusion where clarity should reign. The Persian chariots moved first, 200 side vehicles rolling forward, building speed, blades glinting in morning light. The sound they made, wheels grinding, horses snorting, drivers shouting, carried across the plain like approaching thunder. Macedonian infantry watched them come, phalanx bristling with pikes. Then, just before impact, gaps opened in the formation. Macedonian soldiers stepped aside in coordinated movements drilled into muscle memory, creating lanes through which the chariots passed, mostly harmless, their momentum wasted against empty space. Those that did reach infantry met sarissa points and javelins thrown at close range. Within minutes, the weapon Darius had counted on to break Alexander's center had dissipated, scattered, rendered useless. But the chariot charge had served a purpose even in failure. It had drawn attention, focused eyes on the center while the real battle began to unfold on the wings. Alexander positioned himself with a companion cavalry on the right, moving obliquely forward, angling away from the center. As his horsemen advanced, their movement across the dry plain kicked up dust. Not accidental, not incidental, calculated. The more the cavalry maneuvered, feinting, repositioning, creating the appearance of preparation for a flanking move, the more dust rose into the still morning air. Within minutes, visibility on the Macedonian right began to deteriorate. What had been clear ground became obscured, shapes moving through brown haze. The Persians on their left wing, trying to counter Alexander's movement, found themselves riding into clouds that made precise formation keeping nearly impossible. They could see movement, could hear the sounds of horses and men, but exact positions became guesswork. Alexander had turned the openness of the plain, Darius's greatest advantage, into a fog of war that shouldn't exist in broad daylight. While dust obscured the right, the Macedonian left flank came under immense pressure. Persian cavalry, seeing an opportunity, surged against Parmenian forces holding the line. The fighting there turned brutal quickly. Horsemen colliding, infantry struggling to maintain cohesion against mounted attacks, the entire flank bending under weight it could barely sustain. Messengers rode to Alexander, urgent requests for reinforcement, warnings that the left might collapse entirely. He ignored them, not out of callousness, but because he understood something Darius didn't. This battle wouldn't be decided by saving flanks. It would be decided by breaking the center before those flanks gave way completely. Everything depended on timing, on creating the opening before the army around him disintegrated. The dust continued to rise, thickening with every passing minute as cavalry on both sides maneuvered through it. Persian commanders on the left wing, trying to coordinate their response to Alexander's movements, found themselves issuing orders based on incomplete information. Was the Macedonian cavalry preparing a wide flanking attack? Were they screening infantry movements behind the dust? How many units were actually there versus how many were phantoms created by limited visibility? The confusion compounded. Units moved to counter threats they thought they saw, opening gaps as formation spread to cover perceived dangers. And through it all, Alexander watched, waiting for the moment when confusion would become opportunity. Then it appeared. A gap in the Persian center, opening as units shifted left to reinforce against Alexander's dust-shrouded maneuvers. Not a massive breach, not a collapse, just a seam in formation where attention had drifted away, where commanders had glanced toward the wings and lost focus on what stood directly ahead. Alexander saw it instantly. This was the moment every decision had been building toward. He turned the companion cavalry from their oblique advance and formed them into a wedge, a spearpound of horsemen with himself at the very tip. The phalanx infantry supporting him shifted as well, maintaining contact, ready to exploit whatever the cavalry opened. Then Alexander spurred forward, and the wedge drove toward the gap like a blade seeking a heart. The charge that followed didn't rely on numbers or overwhelming force. It relied on speed, precision, and the psychological impact of a king leading from the absolute front. The Macedonian wedge hit the Persian center at its weakest point, driving through before units on either side could respond. Alexander's cavalry punched through the line, their momentum carrying them deeper with each passing second. The dust that had concealed their exact positions during the approach now worked in reverse. Persian reinforcements couldn't see clearly where the breakthrough was happening until it was already past them. Infantry following the cavalry poured through the gap, widening it, preventing it from closing. Within minutes, what had been a minor scene became a rupture. And then Alexander did something that transformed tactical success into psychological catastrophe. As the wedge drove deeper, its direction became clear, straight toward Darius himself. The Persian king, positioned to command a battle from behind his lines, suddenly found enemy cavalry carving a path directly toward his location. The immortals surrounding him engaged, fighting desperately to stop the advance. But the Macedonian momentum was already too great. Darius, watching his center collapse and enemy cavalry closing the distance with terrifying speed, made a decision that would echo through history. He fled. Not immediately, not without attempting to rally his forces, but once he turned his chariot and began moving away from the fighting, the symbolic weight of that movement could not be contained. Word spread faster than any messenger could ride. The King of Kings was retreating. Soldiers fighting on the Persian wings, already stretched thin by the extended battle line, heard the news and felt their world tilt. If Darius was fleeing, what were they fighting for? Unit began to pull back, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as the realization spread that the center had been pierced and their commander was abandoning the field. The left wing, still engaging Alexander's dust-shrouded cavalry, found itself isolated. The right wing, which had been hammering Parmenians' Macedonians with increasing success, suddenly had no central command to coordinate with. The massive Persian army, which had seemed so overwhelming just hours before, began to fragment. Parmenians' forces on the Macedonian left, which had been on the verge of breaking under sustained pressure, felt the Persian attacks weaken and then cease as enemy cavalry pulled back to avoid encirclement. The phalanx in the center, which had been holding against superior numbers through discipline alone, pushed forward into space the Persians were no longer contesting. And Alexander, at the head of his cavalry wedge, pursued Darius with single-minded focus, understanding that as long as the Persian king remained in flight, his army would continue to dissolve. The chase extended for miles, Macedonian cavalry running down Persian stragglers, but Darius himself escaped, protected by loyalists willing to die, buying him time to reach safety. By afternoon, the plain near Gaugamela was quiet again, but the silence felt different from the morning's tension. It was the silence of conclusion. Bodies lay scattered where formations had collided, where the wedge had pierced through, where cavalry had clashed in clouds of dust that had now settled back to earth. The Macedonian army, exhausted but victorious, began the grim work of counting losses, gathering wounded, securing prisoners. They had lost men, hundreds of them, but they remained intact as a fighting force. The Persian army had simply ceased to exist as a unified entity. Survivors scattered in every direction, heading for home provinces and distant garrisons, their loyalty to an empire suddenly questionable. The victory at Gaugamela opened every door that had been closed to Alexander. Babylon surrendered without resistance weeks later, its citizens welcoming him as a liberator from Persian rule. Susa's treasuries fell into Macedonian hands, funding that transformed Alexander from a conquering warlord into the master of resources that could sustain campaigns for decades. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire, burned months later, whether by accident or design remains debated, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The empire that had dominated the known world for 2 centuries had been shattered in a single afternoon by dust, deception, and one perfectly timed charge. Darius would flee further east, attempting to rally resistance, but he had lost something at Gaugamela that could never be recovered: the aura of invincibility, the belief that the King of Kings commanded forces that couldn't be defeated by a Macedonian upstart. The battle itself became a study in how battles are won before the fighting starts. Alexander hadn't matched Persian strength with equivalent strength. He couldn't. He had created conditions where Persian advantages became irrelevant. The open plains Darius chose to maximize his cavalry, and chariot became the canvas for visual deception when dust obscured the very clarity those plains were supposed to provide. The superior numbers that should have enveloped and destroyed the Macedonians instead became a weakness when the center collapsed and cohesion evaporated. And the decisive blow wasn't struck at the strongest point of defense. It came through a gap that appeared because attention had been pulled elsewhere by maneuvers designed specifically to create that distraction. But beyond tactics and formations, Gaugamela demonstrated something about morale and perception that transcends military science. Darius commanded more soldiers, better resources, home field advantage, and every material factor that should determine victory. What he couldn't match was the psychological weight of an opponent who fought as if defeat wasn't possible. Alexander led the charge personally, positioned himself at the point of maximum danger, and communicated through action that he believed absolutely in the plan unfolding around him. When the wedge drove toward Darius, it wasn't just cavalry seeking a tactical objective. It was a statement that no position was safe, no commander beyond reach. And when Darius fled, he confirmed what his army had begun to suspect, that material advantages meant nothing against an enemy who refused to accept the mathematics of conventional warfare. The implications rippled outward for years. Cities across the former Persian Empire recognized Alexander as their new ruler, not because they loved Macedonia, but because the alternative, resistance against a king who had destroyed the greatest army in the world, seemed futile. The Hellenistic age that followed, blending Greek and Eastern cultures across thousands of miles, emerged directly from this moment when one empire fell and another began to rise from its ruins. Alexander himself would continue east, pushing into India, never losing a major battle but eventually turning back when his army decided it had marched far enough. He died young, never fully consolidating what he had conquered, but the world he left behind was fundamentally different from the one that existed before Gaugamela. In the end, the battle wasn't won by superior numbers or stronger positions. It was won by understanding that warfare is as much about perception as reality, that making an enemy see what you want them to see, or not see what you don't want them to see, can be as decisive as any weapon. The dust clouds that rose from the Mesopotamian plain that October afternoon didn't just obscure troop movements. They obscured intentions, created uncertainty, and transformed clarity into confusion at exactly the moment when Persian commanders needed to understand what was happening most. And in that confusion, Alexander found the opening that ended an empire. The lesson endures, carved into history by a king who understood that sometimes the greatest deception is making thousands of soldiers disappear in broad daylight, right before their enemies' eyes.